Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of NBC Savannah Guthrie, was reported missing from Tucson, Arizona. The disappearance has prompted an active investigation by local authorities and the FBI. Hundreds gathered at a local church for a candlelight vigil to pray for Nancy's safe return, and the community response, from neighbors to colleagues in broadcast newsrooms, has been immediate and raw. On the air, Jenna Bush Hager, a longtime friend and colleague of Savannah's, grew emotional while discussing that vigil, describing the scene and the shared grief and hope that filled it. What follows is a piece of long-form narrative journalism, a portrait, improvisation, and meditation that blends the verifiable facts above with an imagined interior life and scenes meant to help the reader feel the human heart at the center of a public tragedy. Names and events are real. Much of the intimate feeling you'll read here is rendered to convey what it's like to be near someone else's fear and hold a lantern for them until dawn. The studio lights were bright enough to make the faces of the hosts look almost porcelain, smooth planes of public cheer that usually live under laugh lines and perfectly timed anecdotes. Today, though, the brightness felt like an honest spotlight. There was nowhere to hide the tiredness beneath Jenna Bush Hager's eyes. She had spent the morning calling out into a room she knows intimately, the nation that watches today in the quiet or rush of their own days. She had called not to sell a book or launch a feature, but to place a human hand on the shoulder of a friend whose life had been catapulted into a kind of waiting room no one wants to enter. Let's start where our hearts are, which is in Arizona with our dear Savannah and her family. Jenna said at the top of an hour block, the sentence simple and steady like someone learning how to breathe again in front of others. The words were both a prayer and a stage direction, a permission to mourn publicly, to share pain instead of disguising it with the usual television glue. The sentiment, a soft public invitation to hold vigil together, was reported and repeated in outlets across the country, but hearing it in the studio made it immediate, not a headline, but an act. The vigil itself had drawn hundreds to a Tucson church. Candles, low voices, people folding themselves at the edges of a collective hope. There were mothers, grandchildren, friends who remembered Nancy as the woman who never missed Sunday service. There were neighbors who could not forget small idiosyncrasies of a life shared on a cul-de-sac. People came because there is something elementary and human about bringing light when darkness feels too small or too wide. The presence of law enforcement and the FBI hovered like a different kind of light, clinical, procedural, necessary, and reminded everyone that this was not only a thing of prayers but of an active search for a person. It is hard to keep television faces distinct from the people we know from our lives. We invite them into our kitchens by habit. We watch their children grow in the slant of morning light, and they in turn learn to speak to us as if we, too, are part of a familiar family. Jenna and Savannah share more than a professional orbit. They share a corridor of intimacy that is threaded by the particular tenderness of colleagues who have seen one another through births and funerals, book launches and illnesses. So when a mother disappears, the shock does not live only in the private sphere of one anchor's family. It moves like a vibration across the newsroom and into the homes of millions. That shock is what makes Jenna's moment on the air felt as if a neighbor had come to the door and asked to borrow a cup of sugar and a prayer. When the camera cut to Jenna's face up close, the lines around her mouth softened, the way they do when someone is trying to hold back more than a public composure allows. A blink lingered. She spoke as if she were telling a friend about a car accident you can't unsee. The images come in flashes, a flicker of candle flames, the echo of hymn verses, the hush of people standing together, but it is impossible to frame them cleanly. We were there, she said, describing the vigil, and then she paused. Her voice trembled like a rope underweight. Her hand went to the space near her heart as if to steady it, a gesture so small and human it was immediately contagious in the viewers' living rooms. One of the most revealing moments came when Jenna mentioned her daughter, who had been with her at the vigil. She spoke about the uncanny way children can move through adult sorrow, not with a fix but with a presence that simplifies and yet deepens what is happening. She told of her 12-year-old offering small comfort, A hand, a whispered observation, a steadying shoulder that felt both like armor and balm. It was not a plea for sympathy. It was a private snapshot laid briefly on the coffee table of the national television broadcast. Millions saw it, a small life holding a light for another family's missing elder. Outside the studio, in the small waves of the city and the quiet of the churchyard lights in Tucson, there were other stories. The neighbors who had found themselves part of a mystery, the investigators who turned over evidence in the patient, blunt way of their trade, and the family who had been pulled into a public urgency while trying to maintain the fragile privacy of their own grief. A ransom note, described in initial reports, complicated the human geometry of the case, raising unease about motives and manipulations in an age when technology can be used to both help and harm. The FBI's presence, the reward offered, the appeals for proof of life, these are the procedural details that will likely dominate headlines for days, but they cannot entirely extinguish the softer, less certain things that vigil light lets in: memory, hope, prayer. If you have ever stood in a circle with other people watching candle flame breathe, you understand an odd paradox. The flame is both fragile and oddly emblematic of stubborn survival. Each candle is as susceptible as the wax that will melt away, but together 1,000 small flames read as a single, bright insistence. There is still light to be shared. That is the vocabulary of the vigil, and that is the vocabulary Jenna returned to on air as she spoke for Savannah, her sister anchors, and anyone who'd been touched by similar fear. There is a kind of work that belongs to public people when private hurt intrudes on their professional life. There is reporting to be done, statements to be cleared with lawyers, calibrations about when and what to say. But there is another kind of work that does not fit neatly into editorial calendars, the work of presence. It is the shaped silence between sentences. It is the admission that you cannot fix everything. Jenna embodied that kind of presence with a quiet that felt like an offering. It is an offering that, in small increments, retrains an audience to slow down, to listen to the human noise behind the headlines. The evening before the vigil, the neighborhood had been the scene of small, disorienting things that accumulate until they become part of a larger pattern: a doorbell that did not record, a pacemaker app that had gone silent, a white van briefly noticed on a street that otherwise had no reason to be in the news. Tiny specific things become raw in the hands of loved ones because those details are where memory and worry meet. Investigators sift through such particulars, not because they love minutiae, but because they make the shape of absence legible. For neighbors and friends, they make absence unbearably intimate. For the family, they make urgency unavoidable. Jenna, who has built a reputation for bringing books into conversation and offering her viewers a kind of gentle, bedside empathy, felt the gravity of the moment. She has written about love and loss in other contexts. She knows the reality that words are both inadequate and necessary. On television, those words had to be precise enough not to cause harm or interfere with an investigation, while also carrying the warmth of a friend who has been present through other life storms. She chose decisively to anchor the segment in human detail: the vigil, the family's plea, the child who steadied her mother. The choice to let viewers into that story was not only compassionate but practical. Television is, at its best, communal conversation. When anchors speak about a friend in peril, they create an empathy bridge. People who have never met the missing woman can nevertheless stand in the light for a night, hold a candle in their hands, and feel like they have done something. In an age when action often feels like a click, that small embodied ritual is oddly consequential. It creates a network of testimony that is both spiritual and social. Those who were at the vigil will tell others. Those who watch Jenna will send messages. The ripples become cumulative. At the vigil, music did not so much play as fold into the room. Hymns rose and fell, breathing into a silence that had a low, sacred hum. People who rarely speak in public read scripture and poetry. Someone offered a memory: Nancy laughing at a table over a breakfast of burnt toast, her voice rising with delight about a small family victory. Another memory described a woman who always pressed flowers into cards to send in seasons of sorrow or celebration. These recollections function like anchors, extracting the missing person from the category of case and placing her squarely back amid the living. A woman with a habit, a voice, a stubborn affection for names and birthdays. The recollections kept the search from becoming abstract.